My name is Krystal Chin. I am a hydrologist with an environmental consulting firm, and I am based out of Squamish, BC. And I'm currently working full-time, full force in environmental consulting. I took like a very everywhere route. So for my undergraduate, I actually graduated with a Bachelor of Science in geography, in physical geography. So I changed my major 3 times. And sort of just through, taking different classes because I had changed so many majors, by the time I kind of got to 3rd year, I realized I needed to pick something. And then it turns out geography needed one of everything. And so it kind of worked out that I got into geography from environmental science. And then within environmental science, there's different streams within the environmental science in the university I went to. And I picked geography because it was the only stream that I didn't need to take physics. And physics was a weakness of mine, which, funny enough, I had to take physics recently to make up for it. But that's a whole different story. So I actually I didn't work within the field during my undergraduate. I ended up doing an honors degree, which required me to do a thesis. And so I did an undergrad thesis on sedimentology and stratigraphy, looking at this outcrop structure in Hawaii, because why not? Let's go to Hawaii. So it was a very fun experience. Oddly enough, despite of doing my honors thesis in sedimentology and stratigraphy in Hawaii, my stream within my undergrad that I did my honors in was actually glacial geomorphology. So it was kind of a bit of everything. I touched on a lot of different stuff, which kind of, I think, really helped me set up my career in some ways, because now I work in a very multidisciplinary environment. So after I finished my undergrad in glacial geomorphology, I did a master's in science in hydrology, because I didn't want to work in the Arctic or kind of like northern areas, and that's where like most of my peers were going to. And so I did my master's thesis in soil moisture distribution in coastal rainforest in BC. And that kind of set me up to be where I'm at right now. So after my undergrad, and because I didn't really take internship, I ended up working at academia again. So I went and worked for the University of Calgary for 2.5 years as a field technician for the Department of Geoscience. So specifically within like the hydrology and hydrogeology group. And so with all the undergrad programs and all the graduate programs has a lot of overlapping field work with a lot of professors kind of within the department collaborating. And so what I did was kind of, I take all those field programs and I consolidate them and create like almost like a master field program where everyone needs to be. And I also worked in equipment inventory for the department within that section of the department. Because while all of these things are simultaneously going, like a lot of professors are also sourcing equipment for their own programs, but there's a lot of overlapping things that they want to study. And so part of my job is to streamline so that you don't have 5 people doing the same thing, installing the same thing in the same locations. And so I'm streamlining the field program and making sure all of the data are being collected at the time interval required to answer their questions. And so I worked with a lot of grad students, kind of training them in the field, doing a lot of like safety management, a lot of risk management, working between different professors, and then also coordinating the equipment so that they're available for field schools as well, so that they're all calibrated properly. They're all, so everything was very hands-on. So I did a lot of that, the grunt work per se. I was never an author of any papers that they published, but I was always in the acknowledgement section where they're like, thank you for doing all this stuff. So I did that for 2.5 years, but I found that, at that point I've been in academia for 10 years or so, and I was kind of itching to get out to see what the more applied component would be, because, with geological and geography data collection, we're collecting data for like a very long time frame. And so what you want, what we gather in terms of data and for studies like climate change and impacts and all that stuff, like you don't really see anything that comes out of it. And so I wanted to kind of switch gear to make an impact in terms of how environmental decisions are made on a day-to-day basis. And so from then I switched from academia to environmental consulting, working for a private firm.
How was that transition for you? I mean, you have a whole different type of resume versus CV, and selling your skill sets differently, probably different, well, maybe not so much different day to day, but
it was really tough to begin with because I didn't have any industry experiences to know which position I have to apply for when I look at job posting, right? And so I would just look for environmental and then see what happens, right? So a lot of the skill sets, it's like, I know I have a lot of technical skill sets in the field. I know I can MacGyver things in the field, and I know how to, I have skill set that is very applicable for, now in hindsight, now that I'm reading, resumes of new applicants, it's like, I know the skill sets I have, but it's really hard to translate those skill sets into like a CV that goes from academia to industry. And so when I first started looking, I didn't know what I was looking for. I didn't know what companies were doing. I didn't know how, environmental plays into the role of day-to-day life. And so I knew, I had professors that told me that, 90%, over 90% of people who graduate from this would end up working in environmental consulting, but I didn't know what it meant. I was like 25, 26, and I had no idea what any of that stuff meant. So, and I didn't know how, government were structured, or, all these organizations are structured, the feedback system between, data and policies and all that stuff. And so it was really hard to navigate. So when I first started, I kind of went to what I knew, which was field work. So I applied and started working for an oil and gas company in Alberta, doing a lot of field work. So I kind of just went from field to field, but in different sectors. And it was very interesting seeing the difference between data collection methods and how things are processed between academia and public, because or private firms, because we're looking at different timescales.
right.
And we're making like a lot of assumptions, when you're working environmental consulting companies, because they want to know what are the impacts. You're like, well, back when I worked at climate change research, it's like we need years of data to figure that out, right? And now you don't have that years of data to figure out. You have maybe 3 trips per year, and then you write a report, and people make decisions out of those reports. So you're kind of looking, the scrutiny is very different. Not to say we're more relaxed in one or the other, it's just at a different lens and different perspective. So I've transitioned from the field to the office now, and I almost do no field work. So that's like the first difference, right? And so with my job now is I'm both in like kind of the science practice and like the field services. And so I lead a team of field crew for hydrometric gauging. So because I am a hydrologist, what my job is linked to is usually in the aquatics. And so the consulting company that I work for is very heavy into aquatics. And so I work mostly with biologists, because as much as they don't like it, I'm a very important appendix to them, because in order to do any sort of assessment in terms of fish community health related to any resource, extraction projects, they need to know how much water there in the river, and how much, how flow kind of affects different things. In order to determine, when the project gets commissioned at the very, very beginning, there needs to be a lot of things need to be figured out. Are there fish in the river? What kind of fish is there? And what are the requirements of the fish for there to have minimal impacts for this hydro dam to be constructed? And all of those information feeds into kind of like, well, we need to figure out how much water there is. And so the field team that I lead, it is called hydrometric gauging, which all we do is we collect continuous data at different points of the stream in order to try to figure out the hydrological regime of the river, whether it's rain dominated, snow dominated, whichever, all of those like seasonal trends we need to know. And so that's kind of like the field base is installing the equipment in order to get those information to answer these questions. And so because hydrometric gauging is constant, we are collecting 2-minute interval data in multiple points of a river. So all of this information feeds into regulatory compliance, because after the project's been commissioned, which is based on these data that we collect, the baseline data that we collect, the government comes in and say, okay, you have to operate based on these rules. There's, a document that says thou shalt, and then they list all these criteria that they have to abide by. And so my job then becomes, I have to make sure there's enough water in the river to maintain A, the operation, and B, also for the fish. And also to make sure they don't fall out of compliance and break the rules, because then they get slapped on the wrist. So it's kind of constant in terms of my day-to-day. I'm making sure all of the equipment's still working. I get emails all the time. If there's a battery somewhere that's less than 12 volts, I get an email. And then I have to coordinate, field team to go out and fix different gauges. And so I do this for 12 projects. And so that's like kind of I would say 80% of my time falls into managing those projects and making sure that the models that I have built to make flow estimates in these rivers are correct, so that people or these projects are operating on time and by the rules. So, and then the other 20% kind of goes into a lot of like scouting, a lot of analysis, looking at water balances. So I would say the commonality between all of my projects is that I am characterizing the flow regime of a water system, and and then using field data and then using that and interpreting those results to help decision making. It took a long time for me to get to a spot where I'm comfortable with where I'm at. Before I had a lot of complaints. I'm like, oh, I wish I learned how to model. I wish, I had a better professor at this one particular, discipline. I wish I learned whichever, but then all of that is also offset by a lot of mentorship that I received over through, the years from different professors and also from colleagues. And so I'd say now that looking back, I don't have any regrets, because of, I am exactly where I need to be, even though it kind of took a little while. But it also, part of it, it's that it took me a while to figure out what I wanted to do, so when I was working in oil and gas in Alberta, and I'm sure a lot of people go into environmental studies for this reason, it's because they love the outdoor. But then you end up working for, an industry that really compromises, the nature. And a lot of times, like, I had to really ask myself, like, what am I doing? And is what I'm doing actually adhering to, like, there's a lot of ethical questions that I ask myself. I have a friend who, he works in similar environments, and, he told me once, he's like, you can't go into this field with the mindset of like a social worker that you're going to fix things, right? Because the demands are going to be continuous and none of this is going to stop, right? He's like, the best way to do it is to do a good job and to do it well and carry that through and be true to yourself. And I think that was a very good piece of advice, because, I was always, looking at it being like, I'm going to try to do everything in my power to stop them. I'm going to, do all these things. But the truth is, you can't stop them. And the best way to do it is work within the system, right? And do good science and have things that back you up and say, look, I think if you want to build a dam here, that's fine. But please know that, these are the things that are going to be affected. What I would say to myself is that I wish I didn't doubt myself as much when I was younger, because now looking back, it's like I've always know what I wanted, and I always knew what my values are, and I always knew the reasons to why I got into this, what I'm doing now. It's just be confident in your skills. And like when I was in my early 20s working, I was kind of shadowing all these people in academia where they have years and years and decades of experience, right? And so, yeah, like just don't doubt your ability. I know it's really hard to like think about what you're good at, and sometimes, yesterday I was talking to a colleague saying like I don't know what my strengths are, and it's hard to identify those. But like trust yourself, listen to your gut instinct, and I've definitely, and it's very terrifying because there has been times where I've left jobs because I didn't fundamentally agree with what they were doing. And leaving the job, leaving that security is very hard. But I knew I did the right thing. I wasn't going to be complicit in this whole thing and have my name on a report with conclusions I didn't agree with, and so, and when I got out of that, I was like, you know what? I'm going to be one of those people who make decisions that, and then you need to kind of pave your path. And now I'm one of those people who make decisions, and I have a stamp, so.
So Krystal, would you mind talking about the professional geologist designation, what it takes to get it and what it actually means?
Yeah, so a professional designation, it's fundamentally more letters behind your name, but it's an association that's heavily regulated to make sure the discipline that you're working within is regulated. So in different states and different provinces in Canada, you have different requirements to meet, and so my PGeo is actually a geoscientist and not a geologist, because in BC there's an environmental science stream to the association. And so what this means is that I get to sign off on things. So very similar to like architects, architects, you need kind of like a professional designation or license in order to do certain work. So, and that goes the same with people in environmental science and geologists and geophysics, is that all of the work that you do has to be supervised under, someone who has a designation to make sure that the proper procedures are being followed, because there's very real like ramifications if something happens that goes wrong. What the association does is it kind of tracks you. They regulate you to make sure that you are getting, X number of hours of continued education every year to maintain having that designation. They make sure that there's consistent regulation that are being applied to people who are registered under the designation. They make sure, like they make sure all of the stuff that you're doing adheres to, in BC, we call it the Provincial Governance Act. So it's by law that has to be like, okay, under environmental laws, they would have things that say, okay, like this action has to be signed off by someone with a designation. And that way, because the regulators don't have time to go through who is capable at what, right? And so what they do is they assign this assignment to the association, and then the association, you have a number. And so every time you write a report, it gets sent by a certain member with a number. And then they can look up this number to make sure that this member is still in good standing with the association, which means to fulfill all the required things that you have to do. The designation really is kind of a final, in terms of for private industry, it's a final check to make sure that you're doing things correctly. And it's mandated by, like regulatory guidelines that work has to be signed off by a registered professional, whether that be in geoscience, geology, engineering, biology, or whichever.
I feel like I remember reading, you have to take a set of tests, but isn't there a component of it that's supposed to be on ethics?
Yes. So there's like 3 different components. There's like an academic component. So they require you to have like the right degree to do it so that you don't get just anyone applying for this designation. And then with the requirement, they require specific courses, which is why I had to go back and take physics. Because that was one of the requirements. And I told them it's been over 10 years since my undergrad. Can I not take it? And they say, no, you have to take it. Remember the different steps along the way and different people. Listen to people when they talk to you, because there are a lot of times where I had a lot of people who now in hindsight, I realize have made really, to them, like not a big deal, but like for me, very helpful advices and helpful things. And really just remember those and like kind of pay it forward, so I remember starting when I was applying for work, I would ask them if I could go for coffee with them, to talk about the industry. And I still see them in conferences because it's a very small group of people in small field. And it's kind of like they didn't have to sit down with me outside their work and have coffee with this new grad and tell me about, what they do for work and how they can help me. And I've certainly had a few of those people who passed my resume forward or taken my resume and edited them and then passed them forward, and now I'm kind of thinking, well, holy cow, like at the time I didn't like know how big of a deal that was. But now, like when I pass resume forward, I tell those people that I'm passing resume forward, I was like, don't mess this up because my neck is on the line. I am vouching for you. Right? I have an internal reputation in the company that, so it is like, like just all of those little things like people are doing. I would say remember them and just kind of pay that forward. It's always rough, the transition from, I think, school to industry, because it's very different. And it takes a while to find your lane in the industry, but I was kind of like, oh, like I have to characterize this river that's essentially a ditch. It's very different, but the outcome does go to somewhere interesting. All of that builds onto, helping the regulators look at things and see things, because you're essentially their eyes and their ears in the field. So all of those kind of make a difference. So I guess, be grateful of all the things you do. As crappy of a project that it may seem to you at the time, all of those does add up to a bigger picture. And all of those people who help you in the field, like, hey, don't make enemies because you'll definitely see them again. And just be grateful for them, and then pass those onwards. I've received a lot of so many wonderful mentorships, and take the time to sit down with them and say thank you. And then now as a manager, I try to pass those onwards to my directs. And yeah.